Something that most people discover when they start working with data is it's very typical for data not to be in the format that you want it to be in for your analysis. There can be a couple of reasons for this. One can be that it's just been collected by somebody else, a third party, and they've collected and displayed it in a way that makes sense for them, but not so much for you. That can even happen with first-party data, though, because the data might have been collected for some other purpose, for some other part of the organization, and it's been organized in a way that makes sense for their purposes, but is less useful for yours. It can also be just the case because sometimes the system used to collect and store data does so in a way that's not as good for the person doing analysis. So the first thing we often need to do is to get the data in the format that we want it to be in for our analysis. And that format is going to vary a little bit depending on what type of software we're using for our analysis. Database software, for example, tends to prefer data to be in a small number of columns, but it's perfectly fine with a lot of rows. Statistical software can be the other way around. It can need a lot of columns to do what it needs to do, um, and the result of that can be that there's a lot fewer rows. Spreadsheet software is pretty agnostic between rows and columns. So just to give an example of how this can work, suppose that we wanted to get data about where visitors to New Zealand come from, why they come, and how long they stay. There we might want to start with the Statistics New Zealand website, and we might want to then have a look for the relevant topic. So here we're looking for tourism. Once we find the tourism information, then we want to go looking for the specific information that we want. And this can be a little bit of trial and error to find exactly what we're looking for. So here again, I'm looking for tourism data. I happen to know that the particular data that I'm looking for is in the International Travel and Migration Survey, but if you were doing this for the first time, you might need to poke around a little bit to find out exactly what you're looking for. Here you can see that we've got a whole bunch of tables. So again, I would sort of scan these to find what I'm looking for. I'm looking for visitor arrivals, and I want those by country of resident, purpose of visit, and length of stay. Um, so I would click on that. In many third-party tools, such as the Statistics New Zealand website, you've got a lot of choices in terms of how you can display the data. And to the extent that we can get the data the way we want using some of those external tools, that's usually really good for us. So here, for example, I can select all of the different countries that I want to look at because I want to look at them individually rather than all together. I want to look at all of the different reasons that people might come to New Zealand. I want to look at all of these different lengths of stay, and I want to look at it over all of these years. Um, so I can select all of that, and when I do something like this in this tool and many others, I can see, for example, how many rows I'm going to get, how many columns I'm going to get, how many cells I'm going to get of data. And that's really useful information to sort of test whether what I'm planning to do is going to work for my purpose. So here, for instance, I know that Excel, for example, can't display 528 columns of data. I think it's got a limit of 256. So I know I'm going to have to do some manipulation on that. I can also see that it's only going to give me 30 rows. So what I'm going to get is kind of a really short but wide data set if I didn't do anything, and a reasonably large number of cells. So if that's not something that I'm expecting, I could then try aggregating some of this, like I could combine all purposes of travel if that's not going to create a problem for me, or I could reduce the number of years or something like that. But if we just look at the data like this on the screen, and this is a good step to do first, I can look at how all of the data looks. I can find, as I expected, that it's very, very wide, but not very many rows at all. And so I can try to manipulate that now before I even export it to Excel, because I know for a fact that it won't export to Excel just because of the number of columns that there are. So I can edit the table on the screen, and to do that, what I'm going to do is choose Change Layout. This obviously will be a little bit different depending on what tool you're using. Um, but Let's say, for example, that I want different rows for different countries and different travel purposes. And I want to see what happens over time in terms of travelers from particular countries with different travel purposes. So now I've really switched this display around, and what I've got is um, the country of residence, travel purpose, and length of stay nested within each other, and then it's only time that I'm going to see in the columns. And let's just have a look to see how this looks. So we can see here the years. Now we've got a relatively small number of columns because we've only got one for each year. But in the rows now, we have what country people came from, what was the purpose that they came for, and how many came for each number of days. Now, the exact layout that you need is going to be different depending on what type of analysis you want to do. And regardless of what type of analysis you want to do, once you export this information into Excel, which we can do from here if we want to, um, by saying save table to an Excel file, we might still have to do some additional manipulation, but the idea is to get it as close to what we want in the end as possible in the tool, so we have as little manipulation as possible to do once we get it into Excel or whatever the software we're going to use for the analysis.